I was 72 years old when my children divided my life like it was a garage sale. Not a funeral, not a reckoning, a garage sale. Everything marked with an invisible price tag. Everything sorted into piles of who gets what and who gets left behind. And I stood in the middle of it all, watching hands I had held when they were small enough to fit in my palm, reach out and take the things I had spent half a century building. My name is Evelyn Marsh, and this is the story of how I lost everything, found something buried under 30 years of silence and concrete, and learned that the people who truly love you are rarely the ones who share your last name. But before I tell you about the barn, before I tell you about the vault and the letter, and the thing my mother left me that changed every single thing I thought I knew about my life, I have to tell you about the night Arthur died, because that is where all of it began. Arthur Marsh died on a Wednesday evening in late September. He was sitting in his favorite chair, the brown leather one by the window, the one that had molded itself to the shape of him over 30 years. The television was on. A baseball game, I think, or maybe the news. I was in the kitchen making soup, the kind he liked with barley and carrots and a handful of fresh dill, and I heard nothing. No sound, no call for help, nothing. I walked in to ask him if he wanted crackers, and he was just sitting there, still, his coffee mug balanced on the armrest like he might reach for it at any moment. The paramedics said it was cardiac arrest. I could have told them his heart had been closing off for years. I had watched it happen from the inside out. Watched him stop climbing stairs, stop laughing at his own jokes, stop reaching for my hand in the car, the way he used to when we were young. The doctors said it was the disease. I think Arthur spent the last decade of his life slowly letting go. And by the end, there just wasn't enough of him left to hold on. We had been married for 48 years. 48 years of shared breakfasts, of learning each other's silences, of building something out of nothing in a small house in a city called Greenfield, in the hill country of Western Virginia. Arthur had built a logistics company from a single delivery truck and a lot of stubborn work. We had raised 2 children. We had planted a garden every spring. We had argued about money and made up over coffee and grown old in the same bed. The funeral was on a Saturday. My son, Brennan, 49 years old, handled the arrangements with the kind of efficiency that made me feel like I was watching someone close a business account. He wore a dark charcoal suit and greeted everyone at the door with a firm handshake. My daughter, Simone, 45, stood at his side in black. Her expression arranged into something that looked like grief from a distance, that felt up close, more like performance. 400 people came. I stood by the casket for 3 hours and thanked every single one of them. My feet ached. My chest felt like something had been carved out of it with a dull tool. But I stood there because that is what you do. You stand, you nod, you say thank you for coming, and I know he would have loved seeing you here. And you hold yourself together with whatever invisible thread you have left, and you do not fall apart in front of 400 people. I saved the falling apart for 3 in the morning, when the house was dark and quiet, and the baseball game channel that Arthur had been watching was still playing in the living room, because I couldn't bring myself to change it. 11 days after the funeral, Brennan called a family meeting. He used those exact words, family meeting, like we were going to discuss the holiday schedule or decide where to go for summer vacation. He asked me to come to his house, the house Arthur and I had helped him buy 14 years ago, the down payment coming out of money we'd saved by skipping vacations and driving old cars and eating at home instead of restaurants. I drove there in the rain and sat down at his dining room table and looked at my 2 children, and something in me went very still. Brennan had a legal pad. Simone had a manila folder. They had been busy. "Mom," Brennan said, setting his pen down with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this moment, "we've been going through Dad's estate. We need to talk about the house, the accounts, the company." I nodded. I had expected this. Arthur had built a real life for us. The house was paid off. The company was profitable. There were retirement accounts, investment portfolios, savings bonds going back decades. I had helped build all of it. I had done the bookkeeping for the company for 11 years while also teaching school. I had managed every household expense, every tax filing, every insurance renewal. I knew our finances down to the last dollar. The house, Brennan began, and then paused. Dad put my name on the deed 8 years ago. You want me out of my house? Simone jumped in. Mom, nobody's saying you can't take care of yourself. We just think something more manageable. And the accounts? I asked. They looked at each other. That look, the one I had noticed them sharing throughout the funeral, the one that passed between them like a signal I wasn't supposed to catch. We moved the funds into a joint estate management trust, Simone said. Brennan and I are co-trustees. It's just for organizational purposes, to make sure everything is handled properly. You emptied the accounts. We secured them, Brennan said. The word secured landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples spread. 48 years of marriage. Every dollar saved. Every sacrifice made. Every night I had sat at the kitchen table after the children went to bed and balanced the company's books so Arthur could sleep. They had taken all of it in an afternoon and called it organizational. The car? I asked. Simone's taking it, Brennan said. You don't drive on the highway much anymore. It's just sitting there most days. She needs a reliable vehicle. I sat with that for a moment. My car, the one I had driven to the grocery store and to school and to the hospital every time Arthur had an episode. The one I had sat in, alone, in the driveway the night of the funeral, because I couldn't make myself go back inside. Is there anything, I said, my voice level, my hands folded on the table, like I was still a teacher presiding over a classroom, that isn't being taken? Brennan shifted in his seat. Simone opened the folder and shuffled papers. There's the property in West Harlan, Simone said. She almost smiled when she said it, a small, involuntary twitch at the corner of her mouth that told me she found it almost funny. Mum's old place, Grandma Cora's land. Dad always said it wasn't worth anything. The county's been sending notices for years, I said. How much in back taxes? I asked. Brennan checked his notepad. $14,000. The assessed value is actually lower than the taxes owed. Nobody would buy it, Mum. The house has been empty for 12 years. It's probably not even structurally sound. I looked at both of my children. I looked at them for a long time. Then I'll take it, I said. Brennan blinked. Cora's land. The property in West Harlan. I'll take it. Mum, there's nothing there. It's mine. My mother left it to me. Not to a trust. Not to either of you. To me. I'll take it. They didn't argue. They had the house, the accounts, the company, the car. The West Harlan property was a punchline, a half-rotted farmhouse on 11 acres that couldn't grow anything, carrying a tax debt larger than its market value. Letting me have it cost them absolutely nothing, which was exactly what they thought it was worth. I left Brennan's house that evening with my purse, my winter coat, and a small wooden box that had sat on my mother's bureau for as long as I could remember. A carved cedar box with a brass latch, the kind of thing nobody thinks to take because it looks decorative rather than valuable. My mother Cora had pressed it into my hands during her last week of life and said, "Keep this close, Evelyn. It'll matter when it matters." I had kept it for 12 years without opening it. I don't know why. Something in the weight of it, in the way she'd said those words, told me that opening it too soon would be like arriving somewhere before the map made sense. I stayed in Brennan's guest room for 3 weeks. Every single day, I felt it. Cassandra, his wife, exhaled too loudly when I used the kitchen. My grandchildren were told to keep the noise down because Grandma needs rest, which was the kind of phrase that sounds considerate until you understand what it really means. Brennan left brochures on the nightstand. Places with soft names like Hearthview and Meadow Glen. Places designed to make you forget that being moved there was not your choice. On the 19th night, I packed my one suitcase. Everything I owned in the world fit inside it. That fact alone was something I had to sit with for a while. I bought a bus ticket to West Harlan, Kentucky. I had $211 in my pocket. West Harlan was not much to look at from the window of a Greyhound bus. A small town folded into the hills, with a main street that had more closed storefronts than open ones, and a water tower painted with the name of a high school football team from a decade ago. The bus let me off at a gas station at the edge of town, and I stood there in the November cold with my suitcase and asked the attendant behind the counter how to get to the old Cora Bellamy property on Ridge Spur Road. He looked at me like I'd asked him how to get to a place that didn't exist anymore. Cora Bellamy's land? That's out past the second bridge, probably 4 miles east. You family? I'm her daughter, I said. He scratched the back of his neck and glanced at my suitcase. Hasn't been anyone out there in years. Long time. I know, I said. I'm going anyway. I walked 4 miles on a 2-lane road with no shoulder, in November wind that came sharp off the hills and cut straight through my coat. My suitcase had wheels, but the road was uneven, and I ended up carrying it for the last mile. Twice a car slowed down. The first time I waved it on. The second time, an older woman with cropped silver hair rolled down her window and looked at me with an expression caught between concern and plain curiosity. You headed to the Bellamy place? I am. You sure? Very. She looked back once in the rearview mirror, and I noted that. The property was worse than I had let myself imagine. I had last visited 12 years ago, when my mother was still alive and the house was empty, but standing with something like dignity. Now the dignity was gone. The front porch had collapsed on the left side, where a support beam had given way. The roof of the main house sagged in the middle. The paint had long since surrendered, leaving bare grey wood exposed to years of rain and frost. Behind the house stood a stone outbuilding, my mother's old workroom, she'd called it, that I had rarely been allowed inside as a child. Its roof was intact, which surprised me. A heavy padlock hung on its door, newer looking than anything else on the property. That padlock snagged my attention, and held it. My mother had placed it there herself. I had seen it on my last visit. At the time, I assumed it was just her way. Cora Bellamy had always kept her own counsel, private in the way that very old women from very old families sometimes are. Private the way people are when they have learned that sharing things leads to losing them. I walked to the front door of the house. It was unlocked. My mother had never locked the house, just the workroom. Always just the workroom. Inside, the air was cold and stale and smelled of damp wood and old fabric. Dust covered every horizontal surface. Dishes still sat in the kitchen cabinet, white with a pattern of small blue birds that I recognized from childhood breakfasts. The living room had my mother's wooden rocking chair positioned near the front window, looking out toward the workroom. There was a braided rug on the floor that I remembered being made. I had been 5 years old, sitting on the porch, watching my mother's hands work the fabric strips into something that would last longer than she did. I checked the electrical panel. The main breaker was off. I tried it and heard a faint hum from somewhere in the walls. The kitchen faucet ran brown for 2 minutes, then ran clear. I had electricity. I had water. I had my mother's house. I sat in her rocking chair and looked out at the padlocked workroom in the grey November light. And for the first time since Arthur's funeral, I felt something other than hollow. I felt, of all things, curious. That first night, I slept on my mother's mattress under a quilt she had made before I was born. It smelled of cedar and old lavender, and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as her. I lay there, in the dark, listening to the house settle and breathe, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, I realized I wasn't scared. I had expected to be scared. 72 years old, alone, in a broken-down house in a town where I knew no one, with $200 and a mountain of debt on land my children had thrown at me like a consolation prize. But I wasn't scared. I was something else entirely. I was paying attention. I spent the first 3 days cleaning. I swept every floor, scrubbed every surface, boiled water in a pot I found in the cabinet, and used it to cut through 12 years of grime. I found canned goods in the cellar, some so old the labels had gone soft and illegible. Those I threw out. But I also found rows of mason jars, sealed with wax and labeled in my mother's small, precise handwriting. Tomatoes, beans, peach preserves, pickled okra, all of it still sealed, all of it still good. My mother's hands were still feeding me. On the 4th morning, I found an envelope in the mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just my name on the front, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was $350 in $20 bills and a card that said only, "Cora was our neighbor for 40 years. She was a good woman. Welcome home." I stood at the mailbox for a long time holding that money. I didn't ask who sent it. Some debts you don't try to repay. You just accept them and let them change the shape of your heart a little. I used the money to pay the deposits and get the utilities fully restored. I bought groceries from the small general store in town. I found a gas camp stove in the cellar that still worked, and I made myself hot food every evening and ate it at my mother's kitchen table, looking out the window at the workroom. That padlock. It pulled at me the way a loose thread pulls, the way a closed door at the end of a hallway pulls. My mother had kept that room locked for as long as I could remember. Whenever I had asked about it as a child, she'd said it was where she kept her work things, and her tone had made it clear that work things were not for children to wonder about. When I was 9, I pressed my eye to a gap in the stone wall and saw what looked like shelves and glass and something glinting in the low light before my mother appeared behind me, like she'd materialized from the ground itself and guided me firmly away without a word. I had never tried again. Now I was 72 years old, and my mother was 12 years gone, and the padlock was right there. On the 7th morning, I went looking for a way in. But before I found one, something happened that I wasn't expecting. A woman knocked on my door. She was about 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that has been outdoors for most of its life. She wore work clothes and boots, and carried a covered dish. Her name, she told me, was Darlene Foss. She lived a mile and a half down the road. She had seen my light on 3 evenings in a row, and figured someone had finally come to Cora's place. "I knew your mother," Darlene said, standing on my porch with that covered dish balanced in her hands. "Not close, exactly, but the way you know someone when you've been neighbors for 30 years and you've helped each other through enough hard winters. She was a private woman." "She was," I agreed. "But she talked about you. More than you'd probably think, considering." "Considering what?" I almost asked. But something told me to wait. Darlene handed me the dish. Chicken and dumplings. I nearly cried. "There's a man in town," Darlene said, before she turned to go. "Hardware store, just off the main road. His name is Russell Gaines. Retired contractor. Fixes things for people who can't pay him enough, which is most people. If you need help around this place, you go see Russell." I ate half the chicken and dumplings for dinner, and the other half for breakfast, and thought about what she'd said. About my mother talking about me. About the word considering. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me, from which city do you belong? So I can see how far a woman's voice can truly reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories like this one, right to you. Russell Gaines was exactly what Darlene had described, and also something she hadn't mentioned, which was that he was the kind of person who listens with his whole face. 63 years old, with white hair cropped close, and hands that were more scar tissue than skin from a lifetime of working with them. He was behind the hardware store counter when I walked in, reading a newspaper that was 2 days old, and he looked up at me with the particular expression of someone who has learned to read a situation before they've been told anything about it. "Evelyn Marsh," I said. "I'm Cora Bellamy's daughter. I'm living at her property on Ridge Spur Road." Something moved across his face. Recognition, then something slower, something more complicated. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Cora mentioned you, more than once." Darlene Foss said the same thing. "Darlene's right about most things." He closed the newspaper. "What do you need?" "I need to get into the workroom behind the house. There's a padlock on the door. I don't have a key." Russell was quiet for a moment. "Have you looked in the cedar box?" I stared at him. "How do you know about the cedar box?" He looked at me steadily. "Because Cora asked me to remind you to look in it, if you ever came here and found yourself stuck." The world shifted slightly on its axis. I put my hand on the counter to steady myself. "She told you that, about 6 months before she passed. She came into this store on a Tuesday morning, bought a length of copper pipe and a box of linseed oil. And before she left, she said, 'If my daughter Evelyn ever comes here and can't get into the workroom, you tell her to look in the cedar box.' I asked her, 'What cedar box?' She said she'd know." I drove back to the house. I took the cedar box down from the shelf where I'd set it, and undid the brass latch, and opened it for the first time. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a small brass key on a loop of faded red ribbon, and a ring, a plain gold ring, with a small engraving on the inside of the band that I had to tilt toward the light to read. 4 numbers, just 4 numbers, pressed into the gold, in my mother's careful hand. I understood then what she had meant when she said it would matter when it mattered. I took the key and walked to the workroom. The padlock opened on the first try. The door swung inward on hinges that surprisingly did not scream. Someone had oiled them recently, or they had been built so well that even 12 years of disuse hadn't ruined them. I pushed the door fully open and let the November light fall into the room. I was not prepared for what I saw. The workroom was large, larger than it appeared from the outside, built deep into the hillside so that the back half of it was actually underground. The stone walls were solid and dry, the floor was flagstone, and every available inch of wall space was covered with shelving, handmade shelving from thick oak planks, each shelf loaded with ceramic crocks, sealed glass jars, and wooden boxes with latched lids. In the center of the room sat a long wooden work table, scrubbed clean, with tools hung above it on a pegboard in a pattern so deliberate and careful it looked almost like art. Copper tools, glass measuring instruments, things I did not immediately recognize. And beneath the work table, set into the flagstone floor, was a steel door. A hatch, square, about 3 feet across, with a combination lock mounted on a heavy steel latch. The lock was different from the padlock on the outer door. This one was a dial combination, old but well made, the kind of thing that would last 100 years if you kept it dry. I knelt on the cold floor and looked at the lock. Then I looked at the ring in my hand. The 4 numbers engraved inside the band. My heart was doing something unfamiliar. Not fear, not quite excitement. Something older than both of those things. Something that felt like being handed a question you have been waiting your whole life to be allowed to ask. I dialed the combination. Left to the first number, right to the second, left to the third, right to the fourth. The lock opened. I sat back on my heels and pressed my hand flat against the cold steel of the hatch. "Mama," I said to no one, "what did you do?" I didn't open the hatch that day. I know that might surprise you, but I sat on the cold flagstone floor of that workroom for a long time, just looking at it, and something told me that what was underneath was not something to rush into alone. Not because I was afraid of it, but because whatever was down there had been waiting for me for a very long time. A few more hours wouldn't hurt either of us. I went back to the house and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Russell Gaines knowing about the cedar box. About Darlene Foss saying my mother had talked about me, more than you'd think, considering. I thought about the oiled hinges on the workroom door. Someone had maintained that room. Someone had been keeping it. I went back to the hardware store before it closed. Russell was locking up the front gate when I pulled into the lot. He looked at me and waited. "The key worked," I said. "Good. There's a hatch in the floor." He nodded, unsurprised. "Russell, did my mother ask you to maintain that workroom, to oil the hinges, keep the locks clean?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "She paid me to check on it twice a year for as long as she was alive, and she left money in an account at the county bank, to keep the arrangement going for 10 years after she was gone. Instruction was to tell no one and touch nothing." "How long has it been?" 12 years since she passed. Last time I went in was last spring, oiled the door, checked the lock, left. I looked at this man, this stranger who had been keeping my mother's secret for over 2 decades with the quiet reliability of someone who understood that some things are more important than your own curiosity. "Will you come with me tomorrow?" I asked. "I want to open it, but I don't want to do it alone." Russell Gaines looked at the hill country darkening in the distance. Then he looked at me. 7 o'clock work for you?" 7 works. Russell arrived at 7 with 2 thermoses of coffee and a small crowbar he said we probably wouldn't need. We drank the coffee on the porch in the cold and didn't talk much. There was something right about that, about beginning a thing like this in quiet. Inside the workroom, Russell looked at the shelving, the tools, the sealed jars and boxes. He didn't touch anything. He just looked, taking it in, the way you look at something you've wondered about for a long time, and are finally being allowed to see. "What do you think is in the jars?" I asked. "I never looked," he said. "Your mother told me not to." We knelt together by the hatch. I dialed the combination. The lock gave way. Russell helped me pull the hatch back. It was heavy, solid steel, hinged on the far side, and it swung open with a sigh of pressure releasing, like a held breath finally let go. Cool air rose from the opening. Not cold, precisely. More like the air in an old cellar that has been kept at a steady temperature for a very long time. And there was a smell. Not unpleasant. Something herbal. Something warm and deep and unfamiliar. A ladder descended into darkness. Steel rungs bolted to a concrete wall. I went first. The rungs were solid. I counted 9 of them. My feet found the floor, and I stood up, and Russell handed down his flashlight before following. I swept the beam around the space and stopped breathing. The room below was large, larger than the workroom above, which had seemed impossible given the hillside, but it stretched back at least 40 feet, cut into the earth, and lined with smooth poured concrete walls and a ceiling reinforced with thick wooden beams. Along every wall stood shelving units, floor to ceiling, and every shelf was loaded with bottles. Hundreds of bottles, maybe thousands, each one sealed, each one bearing a small handwritten label in my mother's writing. Russell came to stand beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. I walked to the nearest shelf and lifted a bottle carefully. The glass was thick and dark, the seal unbroken. The label read, Bellamy Botanical, 1974, Lot 12, Bottle 8. I looked at the amber liquid inside, held it to the flashlight beam. "Russell," I said quietly. "I see it," he said. I walked the length of the room. The bottles were organized by year. I found labels going back to 1961. The earliest ones were in a different hand, older, shakier, not my mother's writing, but someone who had come before her. The later ones, from the mid-60s onward, were all Cora, has small, deliberate letters on every label, every lot numbered, every bottle counted. "What is this?" Russell asked. I held the bottle in my hands and turned it slowly. I think my mother was making medicine. Because I knew that handwriting on the oldest labels. I had seen it once, in a letter my grandmother had written to my mother before I was born. A letter my mother had kept in a book, and that I had found once, accidentally, and been told to put back without reading. Nettie Bellamy, who had been a root woman in this county before the county decided it didn't want women like that anymore. My mother had carried on her work. In secret, underground, for 60 years. Near the back of the room, I found the work table. Clean, organized, with a lamp connected to a wire running up through a small conduit in the ceiling. On the table, pressed flat by a smooth riverstone, was an envelope. My name on the front in my mother's handwriting. The same careful letters as on every bottle label. Russell turned off his flashlight. "I'll wait upstairs," he said. "Take your time." He climbed the ladder, and I was alone in the room my mother had built under the earth. I sat down on the single wooden stool at the work table. I looked at my name on the envelope. I thought about all the years I had visited this property and never known. All the meals we had shared in the house above me while this room existed, patient and quiet. Waiting. I broke the seal and read, "Evelyn, if you're reading this, then you found the cedar box, and you found the key, and you found the ring with the numbers, and you found your way down here. I knew you would. You were always the one who kept looking when everyone else decided there was nothing left to see. I owe you the truth. I owe you more than that, but the truth is what I have. Your grandmother Nettie was a healer. Not the kind that gets a certificate on a wall, the kind that gets whispered about, and then gets quietly run out of the county when the wrong people decide she's competition. She knew plants. She knew what the land could do for a body that had been hurt by another body, or by years of hard living, or by the kind of grief that doesn't have a name. People came to her from 4 counties over. They came at night, mostly, because coming in daylight meant someone might see, and then someone might ask questions, and questions in those days could end badly, for a woman who knew too much. She taught me what she knew. Every summer from the time I was 9 until I went away to school. The plants, the preparations, the methods of storage. How to seal a botanical extract so it lasted decades without spoiling. How to build a cellar in hillside clay that stays dry and cool year-round. Your grandmother had a cellar too, Evelyn. But it was found in 1948, and everything in it was destroyed by men who decided her kind of knowledge was dangerous. When she rebuilt, she built deeper. She taught me where the second cellar was. I used it until 1961, when I built this one. I've been making and storing botanical medicines for 60 years. Some are simple, tinctures for pain, for sleep, for the kind of low-grade sorrow that takes root in a person and doesn't move. Some are more complex, compounds that I worked out over years of careful experiment, based on Nettie's original formulas, crossed with things I learned from books I had to order through the mail, because the library wouldn't carry them. People have come to me for all of that time, quietly, the way people have always come to women like us. I never charged what I could have. I charged what people could pay, and sometimes I didn't charge at all. But I also kept a separate catalogue. The most refined preparations, the ones I knew had value beyond what this county could understand. I sealed those and stored them here. And I kept records of every formula in the notebooks on the second shelf from the top, left wall. Some of those preparations, Evelyn, are genuinely rare. The botanicals I worked with in the early years are now endangered or completely gone from this region. The compounds I made from them cannot be replicated with what grows here today. There are people in research institutions, in pharmaceutical companies, in conservation organizations, who would pay significant money for authenticated samples. I know this because I looked into it in my last years. I know what exists down here and what it is worth. I never sold it, not because I didn't need the money, because Lord knows I needed it, but because I was afraid that selling it would mean losing control of it. And what Nettie built, what I continued, what you are going to do something with that I can't yet know, it matters more than the money it could bring. The notebooks have the formulas. The jars on the upper shelves, marked with red wax, are the most valuable. Do not break those seals without proper guidance. There is a woman in Harlan City. Her name is Dr. Patience Okafor. She is a botanical pharmacologist at the University Extension. I wrote to her twice in my last year. She knows my name. She does not know about this room, but she will understand what it is when she sees it. Trust her. Evelyn, I know I was not always the mother you needed. I know there were years you thought I cared more about this room than I cared about you. I want you to understand that everything I built down here, I built because I was afraid for you. Afraid that you'd have nothing if Arthur's world fell apart. Afraid that I would leave you with a broken house and a tax debt and nothing else. I built this so that if everything else was taken from you, this would be left. It was always for you. It was always you. Your mother, Cora. I read the letter 4 times before I could stand up. Then I folded it with hands that were steady in a way that surprised me, and I put it in my coat pocket, and I climbed the ladder back up into the workroom where the November light was coming through the one small window above the work table. Russell was sitting on an overturned crate by the outer door. He looked at me when I came up, and he must have seen something in my face, because he didn't ask anything. He just waited. My mother was a botanical healer, I said. She was keeping 60 years of medicinal preparations in that vault. Russell was quiet. Then he said, "What does that mean for you?" I looked around the workroom, at the sealed crocks, the glass jars, the copper tools, at the oak shelving that my mother had built with her own hands. It means I need to find out what it's worth. And then, I need to decide what to do with it. Who do you trust to tell you what it's worth? I thought about the letter, about the name written in my mother's last paragraph. There's a woman at the University Extension in Harlan City, I said. A Dr. Patience Okafor. My mother trusted her. I think I need to go see her. Russell nodded slowly. I can drive you. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, whoever is listening to this right now. Because I know some of you have been where I have been, not in a farmhouse in Kentucky, not with a secret vault in the ground, but in that feeling of being handed the remains of your own life and told to be grateful for the scraps. If you feel my words right now, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me something, from which city are you listening? Write it in the comments. I want to see how far a woman's voice can carry when she refuses to stop speaking. Let's build something here, together. Because the stories I have to tell, stories like this one, they deserve to be heard, and you deserve to hear them. Now let me tell you what happened when Dr. Patience Okafor walked into that vault. Dr. Okafor was 41 years old, compact and direct, with reading glasses she wore on the end of her nose, and a voice that cut through rooms with pleasant efficiency. She drove herself from Harlan City in a university truck loaded with testing equipment she had packed before I'd even finished explaining myself on the phone. She had remembered my mother's letters immediately. "Cora Bellamy," she said when I called. A pause. Then carefully, "I wondered whatever became of that correspondence." "I found the property," I said. "I found what she built. I think you should come and see it." Russell drove me out to meet her at the end of the driveway, and I watched her face as I walked her toward the workroom. She was professional. She kept her expression neutral in the careful way of scientists who have learned not to let their excitement contaminate their method. Then I opened the workroom door, and she stepped inside. Her professionalism lasted about 4 seconds. "Oh," she said softly. "Just that. Oh. The way you say it when a sentence isn't enough." She walked the shelving slowly, touching nothing, reading labels. She leaned in to examine the wax seals, the glass quality, the label ink. When she reached the hatch, she looked at me. "May I?" I opened it. I went down first. She followed. In the vault, Dr. Okafor moved the way a person moves through a place that is larger and more important than they expected. Slowly, carefully, like the floor itself might be significant. She found the notebooks on the second shelf from the top, left wall, exactly as my mother's letter had described. She opened one with gloved hands, and I watched her read. I watched her expression change. 3 times she closed her eyes briefly, the way people do when they are trying to stay calm, and it is requiring real effort. After 40 minutes, she came and sat across from me at the work table. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is preliminary. Nothing is authenticated yet. Nothing has been tested. I cannot give you numbers with confidence until I have brought a team in here and done this properly." "I understand," I said. "Your mother worked with plant species that have not been available for collection in this region since the 1980s. Some of them are now listed as regionally extinct. The compounds she would have been able to make from them in 1961, in 1968, even in 1975. Compounds that are sealed and stored down here, in conditions that frankly, Mrs. Marsh, would be of interest to any scientist working in this field. Marsh, I have never seen replicated outside of a professional archive. Those compounds do not exist anywhere else." I held very still. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. Dr. Okafor removed her glasses and pressed them between her palms. "There are pharmaceutical research programs, academic institutions, conservation organizations that would consider this vault a scientifically significant discovery. Not because of what the preparations might do medically, though some of them may prove extraordinary, but because they represent documented, archived botanical evidence from a period when these species were still viable, as research samples, as historical record, as living chemical data." "How much?" I said again, because I have been a school teacher, and I know how to wait for the answer to the actual question. Dr. Okafor met my eyes. "If authentication confirms what I believe I'm seeing, and if we approach this correctly, we are likely talking about a collection with a research and commercial value somewhere between $15 and $35 million. The number sat between us in the cool air of the underground room. $15 to $35 million. Built jar by jar, year by year, by a woman who had driven a 20-year-old truck and bought her clothes at the church sale and left $350 anonymously in a neighbor's mailbox because she understood that some giving needed to be done without a name attached. She knew, I said, not to Dr. Okafor, to my mother, to the room. She knew what she had built. She was meticulous, Dr. Okafor said. These notebooks are extraordinary. The documentation alone, before we even test a single sample, would be publishable. I stood up. I looked at the rows of sealed jars, the labeled crocks, the careful handwriting repeated hundreds of times in the low light. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Don't release anything yet. Don't tell anyone. Let me bring a proper authentication team. We seal this room, we photograph everything in situ, and we build the provenance documentation before a single jar leaves this space. After authentication, we approach buyers and institutions selectively. With a collection this significant, you do not go to the highest bidder. You go to the right bidder. And if I needed something quickly, to cover taxes and immediate costs?" Dr. Okafor considered. "There is one institution I'm thinking of, a botanical conservation archive in Edinburgh. I know the director personally. He would pay, without hesitation, for a small authenticated selection of the earliest lots. The 1961 and 1962 preparations. I could have preliminary authentication on those within 3 weeks." "Do it," I said. I paid the $14,000 in back taxes with a certified bank check. The woman at the county assessor's office looked at me when I slid it across the counter. This 72-year-old woman who had walked into this county with one suitcase and a cedar box. And she had the grace not to say anything beyond, "Receipt will be mailed." I opened a bank account at the local credit union. I hired a roofer. I had the plumbing fully inspected. I bought a used truck, a solid one, from a lot in Harlan City, where a young man with honest eyes sold it to me without trying to talk me into anything more expensive. I paid Russell Gaines for his 20 years of quiet maintenance, and when he told me what my mother had left in the account for that purpose, I told him to keep what remained as a salary for the next 6 months, because I was going to need his help, continuing to fix this place up. He argued. I won. That is what happens when a school teacher and a contractor disagree about something. Darlene Foss brought me food twice more that month. The third time, I had food to give her back. She sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and told me about the county, about who was trustworthy and who wasn't, about the history of the land out here and what it had been through. She told me things about my mother that I had not known. "Cora helped a lot of people who had nowhere else to go," Darlene said. "Women mostly. Women who needed something the doctors in town didn't offer. She never made a big thing of it. She just helped." "Did people know what she was doing?" Darlene wrapped her hands around her mug. "People knew she had medicine that worked when other medicine didn't. People didn't always ask how or why. That's how it's always been with women like her. You don't ask. You're just grateful." I thought about that for a long time after Darlene left. I thought about my grandmother Nettie, whose cellar had been destroyed by men who decided her knowledge was too much for a woman to hold. I thought about my mother who had rebuilt deeper, who had kept 60 years of silence to protect what had been entrusted to her. I thought about myself, who had spent 48 years being a good wife and a good teacher and a good mother, and had still ended up on a bus with $200 and a borrowed destination. And I thought about all the women who had come to this property in the dark, needing something they couldn't get anywhere else. The Hale Community Aid Center idea, the one that came to me 3 months later, began there, in that thought, in that lineage. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about Simone. She arrived on a Saturday in late January. I saw the rental car from the kitchen window, coming slowly up the newly gravelled drive, and I stood on the porch and waited. Simone got out of the car and stood at the foot of the steps and looked at the house, at the fresh paint, at the repaired porch, at the truck parked beside the woodpile. Her face did the same thing Karen's face would have done. The mathematics of confusion. How does a woman with nothing build something? "Mom," she said, "you painted the house. Russell helped with the sides." "Who's Russell?" "A neighbor." I paused. "Come inside." She sat at the kitchen table, and I made coffee, and we sat across from each other in the house where I had grown up visiting my mother. And Simone looked at everything with the expression of a woman who is calculating without wanting to appear to be calculating. "This is really nice, Mom. I'm serious. But how are you managing out here alone? If something happened to you?" "If something happened to me, I would handle it, the same way I handled 48 years of marriage and 35 years of teaching and 3 months of rebuilding a property alone. I would handle it." Simone's eyes moved to the window, to the workroom behind the house. "What's in that stone building?" "My mother's things." I looked at my daughter. My daughter, who had sat across a table from me with a manila folder and signed her name to a document that emptied my bank account and called it organizational. "Nothing that concerns you yet," I said. "More coffee?" She asked 7 more questions about money and where it had come from. I didn't answer any of them. I offered her the guest room. She said she had to get back. I walked her to the car, and before she left, she turned to me with something genuine briefly crossing her face. A flash of the girl she had been, before ambition and her brother's influence had taught her to calculate everything. "Are you actually okay?" she asked. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm home." She drove away, and I called Russell and told him my daughter had come and that Brennan would follow, and that I expected things to escalate. I was right. The court papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks later. My son and daughter were petitioning to have me declared mentally incompetent and to have Brennan appointed as conservator of my personal estate, including any assets associated with the property. The petition cited my age, my sudden relocation to an isolated rural property, my apparent financial activity that my children could not account for, and my vulnerability to exploitation by unidentified parties. I read the document twice at the kitchen table. Then I set it down and looked out at the workroom and the bare winter fields beyond it. I was not afraid. I had spent 3 months rebuilding something from rubble with my own hands. I had paid $14,000 in back taxes. I had had electricity and running water and a truck and a lawyer on retainer. I had a letter from my doctor, whom I had visited the previous month in Greenfield, and who had administered a full cognitive assessment and written a statement that I was in excellent mental and cognitive health. I had records of every dollar that had entered and left my bank account since I'd arrived in West Harlan. I had a paper trail that said unambiguously, "This woman knows exactly what she is doing." But I also had Russell, who drove me to the lawyer's office the next morning without being asked, and sat in the waiting room while I laid out everything on the desk. The trust documents, which my mother's attorney had filed in 1985, and which I had found in a second envelope inside the Cedar box. Documents establishing an irrevocable living trust, naming me as sole beneficiary of the property and all its contents. The bank statements, the tax receipts, the doctor's letter, and finally, carefully, the appraiser's preliminary assessment from Dr. Okafor, which I had requested in writing with specific dollar figures removed, confirming the presence of a significant botanical collection on the property. The attorney's name was Harriet Sund, 60 years old, with the kind of calm that comes from having seen everything and found most of it less surprising the second time. She read every document. She asked 4 questions. Then she sat back in her chair. "This conservatorship petition is going to fail," she said. "They have no medical basis. They have no evidence of exploitation. What they have is suspicion, and suspicion does not meet the legal standard. The burden is entirely on them. Will a judge take it seriously? A judge is required to hear it, but I want you in that courtroom with everything you've brought me today, and I want Dr. Okafor prepared to submit an affidavit confirming the nature and legitimacy of the collection. Your children are going to claim you found money through suspicious means. We are going to show the court exactly what those means were, and establish that every dollar came from legitimate assets on property you legally own." "What about the full value of the collection?" Harriet considered. "We don't need to disclose the full valuation. We need to establish that the source of funds is legitimate, not that you are wealthy. Those are different things. I'll tell the court there is a valuable collection under independent expert assessment. That is true, and it is sufficient." I nodded. "What's the hearing date?" "I'll request an expedited date. My guess is 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. I used them. I drove to Greenfield and saw my doctor. I gathered every document Harriet had requested. I worked with Dr. Okafor to finalize the preliminary authentication on the 1961 and 1962 lots, which sold to an institution in Edinburgh for $420,000, funds that arrived in my account in 3 wire transfers over 10 days. I paid 5 years of property taxes in advance. I put money into a property improvement fund. I retained Harriet formally and paid her in full, and I kept the rest in documented, organized, accessible accounts where every dollar had a paper trail, a timestamp, and a legitimate source. I also planted a winter garden Not because it would survive necessarily, but because planting things is an act of faith, and I needed to practice faith. Russell came every Tuesday and Thursday. He repaired the porch steps, replaced the gutters, rebuilt the garden fence with posts he cut himself from timber on the back of the property. He never asked about the money or the vault or what was going to happen. He came when he said he would come, and worked until the work was done, and drank his coffee in the morning, and said good morning and good night, and that was enough. One evening, sitting on the porch in the January dark, I asked him why he had maintained the workroom for 20 years without question. He thought about it for a long time. "Your mother asked me to," he said, "and she said it mattered. And in my experience, when a woman like your mother tells you something matters, it does." "A woman like my mother," I said. "What kind of woman is that?" "The kind who builds things nobody else can see yet." The hearing was on a Thursday. I drove myself to the courthouse in Harlan City in my truck, wearing a gray dress, and my mother's ring on my right hand. The ring with the 4 numbers on the inside, that had opened a lock, that had opened a room, that had opened a life I hadn't known was waiting for me. Harriet met me on the courthouse steps. Brennan was already inside, seated at the petitioner's table with his attorney, a man I'd never met, who wore the kind of suit that announces its own price tag. Simone sat beside Brennan with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the version of concern she'd been wearing since the family meeting. I noticed she was wearing a different coat from the last time I'd seen her. New, expensive. I sat at the respondent's table and opened my folder. I didn't look at my children. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the particular patience of someone who has presided over family court long enough to have heard every variation of this story. She read the petition. She asked procedural questions. Then she looked at Brennan's attorney. "Counselor, you filed for conservatorship on the grounds of mental incapacity. What is your evidence?" Brennan's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the respondent is a 72-year-old woman who, following the death of her husband, relocated without her family's knowledge to an isolated rural property she had not visited in 12 years. Since her arrival, she has engaged in significant financial transactions, totaling several $100,000, the source of which her family cannot identify. We believe she has been unduly influenced or exploited by persons in the community." The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Marsh, your response." Harriet stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to present the following." And she laid it out. All of it. My medical records, the cognitive assessment. The Irrevocable Living Trust, established in 1985, naming me as sole beneficiary of the property and all contents. The property deed, the bank statements, the tax receipts, the repair invoices, the truck purchase agreement. A timeline, prepared by Harriet and checked by me, of every decision I had made in the 4 months since arriving in West Harlan. Each one documented, each one rational, each one traceable to a clear source. Mrs. Marsh relocated to property she owns free and clear under an irrevocable trust established by her mother 37 years ago, Harriet said. She paid $14,000 in overdue property taxes within 3 weeks of arriving. She has restored the residential structure, obtained necessary utilities, purchased a vehicle, opened a bank account, and maintained clear and documented financial records. Her physician has certified her as cognitively sound. The financial transactions in question originate from the legitimate sale of authenticated assets held within the trust property. The funds are hers, the property is hers, the assets are hers. Brennan's attorney tried to push back. The source of the funds has not been fully disclosed. The source has been documented, Harriet said calmly. The trust property contains a significant collection of botanical materials, currently under expert assessment by Dr. Patience Okafor of the University Extension. Preliminary authentication has been completed on a portion of the collection, which has been sold through legitimate channels to a registered research institution. All transactions are documented and tax reported. We have the records here. The judge looked at Brennan. Mr. Marsh, do you have medical testimony, a psychiatric evaluation, a physician's statement indicating any reason to doubt your mother's capacity? Brennan looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. No, Your Honor, not at this time. The judge removed her glasses. She looked at Brennan and Simone for a long moment. Then she said, I'm going to be direct. This petition has no medical basis. The respondent has demonstrated consistent, documented, and competent management of her affairs. There is no evidence of exploitation, confusion, or incapacity. The petition is dismissed. She looked at Brennan again. Mr. Marsh, I'll note for the record that filing a conservatorship petition without medical evidence causes significant distress to the respondent and wastes this court's time. I would encourage careful consideration before any further filings. The gavel came down. Brennan's face went to a color I had never seen on it before. Simone looked at her hands. I closed my folder, thanked Harriet quietly, and walked out of the courtroom. Brennan came after me in the corridor. I heard his footsteps and stopped and turned. He looked older than I had noticed. Or maybe I was noticing it for the first time. Mom, his voice was controlled, tight. What assets? What did you find on that property? My mother's work, I said. How much is it worth? That's not your concern. He stepped closer. I'm your son. Then act like it, Brennan. His jaw moved. You can't just appear out of nowhere with money and property and... The house was mine, I said, very quietly. The accounts were mine. The car was mine. You took those. The property in West Harlan was mine before you were born. I am not shutting you out of anything that was ever yours. I am keeping what is mine. I'll challenge the trust, he said. I'll find a way. I looked at my son. I looked at the boy I had made lunches for and driven to every practice and sat with through every failure and celebrated at every success. I looked at the man that boy had become, and I felt a grief that was separate from anger, quieter than either. The grief of watching something you loved make choices it cannot come back from easily. The door is always open, I said. Not to what I have, to me. Those are different things. I hope you learn the difference. I walked out of the courthouse into the thin February light. Simone was waiting outside. She was not composed. Her mascara had run. Her coat was open despite the cold, as if she had rushed out without thinking. She looked for the first time in years like my daughter, and not like a woman who had arrived at my life with an agenda. Mom, she came down the steps toward me. I need to say something. All right, I'm sorry. Her voice cracked on the second word. Not performed, real. The difference is something you learn to hear. I'm sorry for the accounts, for the car. I'm sorry I signed those papers and told myself it was for your benefit, when I knew it wasn't. And I'm sorry for the conservatorship. I told Brennan I didn't think it was right, and then I signed anyway. I stood on the courthouse steps and let her say it. Why? I asked. She pressed her lips together. Her breath was uneven. Because Brennan makes things seem reasonable when they're not. He always has. And I didn't want to fight him. And I was. She stopped. I was afraid of what it would cost me to say no to him. And it was easier to tell myself that what we were doing was helping you. But it wasn't. No. Just that. No. I looked at her face, the face that has Frank's jaw and my eyes, and a tiredness in it that I recognized because I had worn it for years. The tiredness of being the person who goes along with things because the cost of not going along is too high. You can come back, I said, when you're ready to come back as my daughter, not as someone looking for what I have. As my daughter. Do you understand the difference? She nodded. She could not speak. Good. Go home. Think. When you're ready, you know where I am. She hugged me on the courthouse steps, not quickly. And I held her back. Because she is my daughter. Because some things survive what gets done to them. Because I have spent enough of my life letting go of what I still want to hold. Then she got in the rental car, and I got in my truck, and I drove home through the February hills with the heater running and the radio off, and the morning opening up around me. Spring came to West Harlan the way it comes to hill country. Slow, and then all at once. One morning the ground was still frozen, and there was frost on the truck windshield. And 3 mornings later, there were crocuses at the base of the workroom wall. And the creek at the bottom of the property was running loud and clear, and the fields were threaded with green. I watched it come in from the porch with my coffee. The farmhouse looked nothing like it had in November. Fresh white paint. New porch planks, cedar, milled by Russell from a fallen tree on the property line. The broken windows replaced. The kitchen rewired. The gutters running clear. The garden behind the house turned and planted. A real garden. Not the winter gesture I'd made in January, but a real one, with tomatoes and beans and squash and the herbs my mother had grown, that I had learned the names of from her notebooks. A botanical vault, as Dr. Okafor and I had taken to calling it, was proceeding with careful deliberateness. The authentication team had spent 2 weeks on site in March, photographing every shelf, testing every lot, building the provenance documentation in layers. Dr. Okafor called it the most significant botanical archive she had encountered in her career. Her words, not mine, though I privately agreed that my mother had been extraordinary. The sales were managed in small, selective lots. Nothing flooded. Nothing rushed. 4 institutions in 5 months. A botanical archive in Edinburgh. A pharmaceutical research program in Montreal. A conservation organization in Atlanta that was working to restore endangered Appalachian plant species. A university research center in Ohio that specialized in traditional knowledge preservation. Each sale was documented, each dollar reported. Each transaction handled through Harriet's office with the precision my mother would have approved of. I was not rich the way people mean when they say the word rich, the way it implies a kind of ease that floats above the real texture of living. I was, more precisely, secure. For the first time in my life, genuinely, structurally secure. Not because of what Arthur had built, not because of what Brennan had allowed me to keep, but because of what 2 women, one of them my grandmother and one of them my mother, had spent their lives building in the dark and trusted me to find. I opened the community center on the first Monday of April. I had bought the building, an old general store on the edge of town that had been empty for 3 years, in February. Russell had spent 6 weeks on the interior, replacing the flooring, repainting, installing proper lighting and a heating system that actually worked. Harriet helped me set up the non-profit structure. Dr. Okafor connected me with a social worker from the university who came twice a week on a stipend I paid from the foundation account. The sign above the door read, Bellamy Resource Center. My mother's name, my grandmother's name, the name of 2 women who had spent their lives helping people who had nowhere else to go and had never asked for recognition in return. I was asking for a little recognition, on their behalf. I thought they'd understand. The center opened quietly. No press release, no ribbon cutting, a door that was open, and a woman behind a desk who knew what it felt like to have everything taken. Within the first week, we saw 9 people. An 80-year-old man whose son had transferred his house to himself, while the man was in the hospital recovering from surgery. 2 women who had been left out of their husbands' estates in ways that seemed legal until Harriet looked at the paperwork and found otherwise. A veteran who couldn't understand the benefit forms. A young woman with 2 children trying to navigate a housing assistance application that the county office had lost twice. I didn't counsel them. I connected them, knowing who to call, who to send them to, how to get them from the problem to the person who could solve it. Russell came every Tuesday and Thursday. He helped with paperwork, drove people to appointments in his truck, fixed whatever needed fixing in the building. He never talked about why he did it, he just showed up. That was enough. That was, I was learning, one of the most important things a person can do. One evening in late April, we were sitting outside the center after closing. Russell on the steps, and me in a folding chair that I refused to admit was not as comfortable as I was pretending. 6 months ago you walked into town with a suitcase, Russell said. I know. Now you've got a community center and a vault of things worth more than most people in this county will earn in a lifetime. He shook his head slowly. Your mother planned that. She planned a long time, I said. Not just the vault, she planned you. She knew who you were. She knew you'd come here and figure it out. I thought about the letter, about the last lines. It was always for you. It was always you. She was building something for me, I said. Even when I thought she was just disappearing into that workroom, instead of being with me, she was building something. Russell looked out at the hill country going gold in the evening light. Some people show love loudly, he said. Others dig you a vault and hope you find it. I laughed. It was a real laugh, from somewhere deep and unburdened, and it surprised me with its lightness. The call from Simone came on a Saturday in May. I was in the garden, on my knees in the dirt, planting a second row of beans, when the phone rang. Mom, it's me. I know who it is, Simone. Can I come visit? No agenda. I sat back on my heels and looked at the garden, at the rows of things coming up from the turned earth, at the workroom wall beyond it, solid and quiet, at the hills beyond that, green and patient. "Come next weekend," I said. "Friday evening if you can." She arrived on Friday in a car that was not the one she had taken from me. She came alone. No Brennan, no attorney, no folder. Just a weekend bag and a plant she'd bought at a nursery on the drive down, a small rosemary bush in a terracotta pot, which told me she'd been paying attention and didn't know how to say it directly. We sat on the porch that evening. The air was warm, and the hills were dark, and the first fireflies were beginning in the field below the house. "This place," Simone said. "It's completely different from when I came in January." "It was always beautiful," I said. "It just needed someone to take care of it." She was quiet for a while. Then, "Brennan is angry. He feels like you humiliated him in court." I defended myself in court. If he felt humiliated, that's between him and his reflection. He's been talking to a different attorney. Let him talk. Simone turned to look at me. In the lamplight from the kitchen window, she looked younger than she had in years. "Aren't you scared?" "Of what?" "Of him doing it again, of all of it." I considered that honestly. "No," I said. "I used to be scared of losing what we had built. The house, the accounts, the life Arthur and I made. I was scared of losing it, and then I lost it, and I discovered that what I had built without Arthur, or rather, what my mother had built for me, that couldn't be lost the same way. It's in the ground, Simone. Literally and figuratively. You can't just put it in a trust and give your brother a co-signature." Simone laughed despite herself. A small, real laugh. We talked until the fireflies were thick, and the crickets were loud, and the coffee had gone cold. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. Her marriage, which was struggling with a quiet persistence she had not told me about. Her work, which had stopped feeling meaningful somewhere around the time the money got good. Her children, my grandchildren, who she said missed me more than she had realized until they started asking. She cried once. Real tears. I gave her a paper towel because that's what I had, and I think real moments deserve practical things. The next morning she came with me to the center. She sat in the back and watched me work with a woman from the next county over, 68 years old, whose adult son had power of attorney over her affairs and had been using it to pay his own debts. She watched Harriet explain the legal steps. She watched me make coffee and sit with the woman at a table and listen while she talked. When we were in the truck, driving back to the farm, Simone was quiet for a long time. "That woman could have been you," she finally said. "Yes," I said. "She could have." Before she left Sunday afternoon, Simone stood by her car and looked at the workroom. "What's actually in there, Mom?" I smiled. "Come back next time, and I'll show you." She hugged me, properly, both arms held on. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Simone." She drove away. I watched until the car was gone. Then I walked to the garden, and knelt in the dirt, and planted the rosemary she had brought in a spot near the gate where I would see it every morning. Here is what I want to say to you now, directly, before I finish this story. If you feel my words, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me, from which city are you listening tonight? I want to see exactly how far a woman's voice can carry when she refuses to be quiet. Drop your city in the comments. Help me build something here, this community, these stories, because every woman who has ever been handed the broken pieces of her own life and told to be grateful deserves to hear that someone else picked those pieces up and built something extraordinary from them. That is what we are doing here. Together. Now let me tell you how the story ends, or rather how it doesn't end, because this kind of story doesn't end. It just keeps growing. I am 73 years old now. My birthday came in February, which is the coldest month in hill country, and also, I have decided, the most honest month. Everything strips down to what it actually is. The trees bare, the ground hard, the sky a particular shade of grey that means something real is on its way. Russell brought me a lemon cake from the bakery on Main Street. We ate it on the porch in the cold, with our coats on, which is something I recommend if you have the right company. He said, "Happy birthday, Evelyn." I said, "Thank you, Russell." And then we sat and watched the hill country in February. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of enough that used to seem impossible from where I was sitting, in a guest bedroom in my son's house, reading brochures for places with soft names, trying to find a thread of my own life to pull. The botanical vault is about 60% sold. Dr. Okafor manages the process with a care that my mother would have respected deeply. We have established a partnership with 2 conservation programs that are using the archived compounds to guide replanting efforts for endangered Appalachian species. That was not in the plan, the formal plan, but it was in the spirit of it. My grandmother Nettie collected those plants from land that has since been stripped and paved and developed. Using what she preserved to bring those plants back to that land feels like the kind of sentence that wants to be a complete thought. Simone came back in June. She kept her word. She came as my daughter. I showed her the vault. She descended the ladder slowly, and when she reached the bottom and I swept the flashlight across the shelves, I watched her face do what everyone's face does in that room. The thing that happens when you encounter something larger than your expectations. She walked the shelves for a long time without speaking. Then she came to stand beside me at the work table. I had the letter out, my mother's letter, the one I had memorized by then. Simone read it. She read it twice. When she set it down, she was crying, but quietly, the way you cry at something that moves you rather than something that hurts you. "She knew you'd need it," Simone said. "She knew I'd find it," I said. "She trusted me to know what to do with it." Know what to do with it? I thought about the center, which was now seeing 25 people a week, about the conservation programs using Nettie's collected plants to rebuild what had been lost, about the tax receipts and the bank statements and the truck in the driveway and the garden coming up and the porch that Russell had built and the rosemary at the gate. "I'm figuring it out," I said, which is probably what she expected. Simone reached out and took my hand. We stood in the room my mother had built under the earth, holding hands in the flashlight dark, 2 women at different distances from the same inheritance. Brennan called in August. I picked up the phone on the second ring. "Mom." His voice was different, not the controlled voice from the courthouse corridor. Something underneath the control had shifted. "Brennan." A long pause. "I need to say something." "All right. I've been thinking." Another pause, longer. "I've been thinking about what you said, that the door is open, that there's a difference between the door to what you have and the door to you." "Yes," I said. "I think I mixed those up," he said. "I think I've been mixing them up for a long time." I sat down in the kitchen chair. Outside the window, the August garden was wild and green and alive. "What made you think about it?" I asked. "Simone," he said. And a pause. "One of my clients, a man about my age. His mother died last month and left everything to a charity. He came in furious, wanting to contest the will, and I was listening to him and I kept thinking, she had the right. She had the absolute right, and I thought about you." I didn't say anything. "I'm not asking for anything," Brennan said. "I'm not asking to know what's on the property, or to come see it, or to be part of any of it. I just wanted to say that I was wrong. What we did to you was wrong. I told myself it was responsible, and I knew it wasn't, and I did it anyway, and I'm sorry." The kitchen was quiet. I could hear the garden through the open window, the sound of insects in the green. "The door is open," I said. "Come when you're ready. Come as my son." "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said back. We hung up. I sat for a while in the kitchen, quiet. Then I got up and went outside and stood in the garden in the August sun and ran my fingers along the top of the bean plants coming up on their poles and thought about my mother, who had spent 60 years building something in the dark so that I would have something to stand on. I thought about Nettie, who had built something before that and had it destroyed, and rebuilt it and built it deeper. I thought about all the women before them, back and back, the women who kept things in jars and knew what the land could do and carried the knowledge through whatever tried to take it from them. And I thought about the center and the woman we had helped last week, who had walked in with nothing and walked out with a housing referral and a legal appointment, and the particular look of someone who has just realized they are not as alone as they believed. And I thought about you, about whoever is listening to this right now, in whatever city, in whatever version of the story, where you are the one who was handed the broken pieces and told to be grateful. Here is what I want to say to you. You are not the sum of what was taken from you. You are the sum of what you do next. My mother dug a room under the earth with her own hands and filled it with 60 years of careful work and trusted me to find it at exactly the moment I needed it most. I did not know it existed for 72 years, and then, when I had nothing else left, I found it. Sometimes the inheritance is underground. Sometimes it is in a cedar box on a shelf you never thought to open. Sometimes it is in the things you have survived and the knowledge you have accumulated, and the people who show up with coffee and a jackhammer, and don't ask for anything in return. Russell Gaines showed up. Darlene Foss showed up. Dr. Patience Okafor showed up. They showed up because my mother had built relationships, quiet and steady over decades, based on showing up herself. That is the lesson. Not the vault. The vault is just the material thing, the thing you can count and photograph and sell in documented lots to research institutions. The real lesson is the vault of relationships, of quiet, persistent, unremarkable presence, of doing what you said you would do, of keeping what you were trusted to keep, of showing up when you said you would show up. My name is Evelyn Marsh. I am 73 years old. I live on my mother's land in West Harlan, Kentucky. I have a garden and a truck and a community center with my grandmother's name on it, and a friend named Russell who brings lemon cake in February and sits on the porch and watches the hills go dark without needing to fill the silence. I have what matters. I lost everything I thought I had, and I found everything I was supposed to have, because a woman who loved me spent 60 years building it in secret, and trusted me to be the kind of person who would keep looking when everyone else had decided there was nothing left to find. She was right about me. I am trying every day to be right about you. If you feel my words, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments. I mean it. I want to see how far this voice travels. I want to know that a woman speaking the truth in a quiet room can reach someone in a city she has never visited, in a life she has never lived, and say something that is still true. We are building something here. These stories, these voices, this community of women who refuse to disappear. That is what my grandmother started. That is what my mother continued. That is what I am carrying forward. Come with me.